Welcome everybody to Study 6 in our series in the book of Galatians. So far in the book of Galatians, we have been onlookers at a battle between law and faith. Paul has vigorously been defending the gospel of grace from attack by those who would require Gentile Christians to fully obey the Old Testament law. Now, Paul has been thundering on about how no one is justified by law-keeping, that there's only one way to be declared right with God, and that is through Christ's atoning death on the cross. It's the only way to be saved, and if you try to add law-keeping to faith as an additional requirement, you've misunderstood the whole thing, and actually destroyed the very essence of faith. The blessings promised to Abraham flow out to the Gentiles through faith, and not through the law. So if you want to be a true Jew, if you want to be a true child of Abraham, then receive the promise by faith, just as Abraham did. This has been Paul's argument up to this point. But all of this leaves us with one big question hanging over us. What purpose does the Old Testament law serve? Now the Spirit was poured out not through law-keeping, but through the gospel of grace. So then why did God bring in the law in the first place? What place does the law have in the Christian life? And it's to this question that Paul now turns in his letter. What we're looking at and what we see described here are several images that help us to see both the place and the purpose of the Old Testament law. Paul describes it as a jail keeper who kept God's people locked up or restrained until Christ came. He calls it a school teacher or a childminder, when in verse 24 he refers to it as being put in charge. He calls it a guardian and a trustee, and he says that it is there to provide supervision. These are images that Paul's readers would have understood very well. You see, in the ancient world it was common for a well-educated slave to be put in charge of the son of a wealthy family. This slave would train, teach, discipline, and exercise complete control over that child. Then, when the child came of age and passed youth and was a young man, and it came time for him to take his inheritance, he would take it. And the positions of the child and the slave would be reversed. The slave would now be under command of the heir. These images all serve to emphasize that the law that God gave to Old Testament Israel was always meant to be a temporary measure. Its role was to restrain and to educate, to put a brake on sinfulness, and to put boundaries in place inside which God's people could live until Christ came. Its function was never to save or justify, says Paul. Now that faith in Christ has come, the law is no longer in charge. It's no longer a supervisor. We're no longer slaves, but sons and heirs to inherit an inheritance that God has provided for us. In all this, we must remember that the people who were troubling the Christians in Galatia were from a Jewish background. They were trying to persuade the Galatians that whether they were Jewish or not, they still needed to keep the Old Testament law if they were going to be genuine Christians, if they were going to be authentic Christians, if they were really going to be acceptable to God. Now, in reply to these troublers, Paul is saying that the Old Testament law was a temporary measure in God's plan. It applied to the Old Testament people, the Israelites, but only until Christ came, and then its supervisory role and function would be over. So now it's not the supervisor of the Jews, and it's certainly not the supervisor of the Gentiles, because, that's right, Christ has come. Now all can inherit the promise to Abraham. Now all can be sons of God through trusting in Jesus Christ. Think of it in these terms for a second. Can you imagine Nelson Mandela, freed from imprisonment after 25 years, going back to Robben Island and asking to please be locked up again? Can you imagine a student finally graduating from university after years of education, re-enrolling in primary school to do it all over? Can you imagine a street kid picked up from the gutter and adopted into a warm, accepting family, choosing to go back to homelessness? It's on this level that Paul is so astonished at the way that the Christians in Galatia were behaving and acting. He can't believe what they're doing. He's saying, why would you ever want to imagine or dream of going back to slavery? You've been freed. You've been freed from all the pagan mumbo-jumbo. You've been freed from religious observances of your old life. What's more is not only have you been freed, but you've been freed adopted into God's very own family through faith in His Son. Why on earth would you want to keep going back to law-keeping? Again and again and again in this letter to the Galatians, we've been taught these sorts of things. That the gospel of God's grace in Christ has freed us from the slavery of the law. It's freed us from being religious and trying to please God through doing certain things. It's freed us from trying to earn our way to heaven. It's freed us into God's family. Whether we're trying to do the things of God's Old Testament law or the things of human religion, or just things that we think are going to be pleasing to God and are going to help me to make the grade, or help me to get into heaven because all of a sudden God's going to look favorable upon me, Galatians has blown it all up in our face. Now, the Old Testament law was certainly part of God's plan. It served a very important function, but now that Christ has come, its very important function, its supervisory role, has ended. It's no longer in power of God's people. So now we're not children in slavery, we're sons and heirs to God's inheritance through faith in Jesus Christ.